I know some of you have wanted me to cover this topic for a while, which is nice, because I've wanted to cover it for a while myself. If you look at the outline of Portland, Oregon's city streets, with obvious exceptions, in particular where there are elevation changes, it's a pretty clean setup. Mostly a grid system with numbered streets going north and south, with the exception of those to the north end of town and east of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and named streets running east and west. Each block, the address numbers increase by 100, as has been normal for a long time, but wasn't always the case in Portland. For the most part, it's a pretty easy place to get from point A to point B without getting lost. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, once upon a time, it wasn't even close. September 2nd, 1931. Portland's City Council passed Ordinance Number 61325, which, as they put it, was to provide for the renumbering of buildings and the renaming of streets. Before I get going, let me just say there's a lot of geography mixed up in this. Districts, street name changes, number changes, prefixes added. I will try and keep my discussion of this detailed topic as simple as I can, but there's a lot that happened here. I had like 30 pages of notes to work with. And I will be making a lot of my high-quality, cutting-edge graphics and diagrams to accompany what I say to hopefully keep things easy enough to follow. From there, diving on in. In short, the system of addresses in the city was a jumbled mess that needed to be, for lack of another word, addressed. And this would also include the manufacturing and disseminating of tiles bearing the numbers of new addresses to be placed on the city's buildings and homes. And why were there so many problems? To try and manage a discussion on that, there is a 40-year period of time that needs to be understood. Up until 1891, the actual city of Portland was primarily just the area that makes up downtown today. But by this time, the east side of the Willamette River had been blossoming as well. In particular, the area directly across from what you could call original Portland was known simply as East Portland, and just north of East Portland and along the river was the town of Albina. With the motivation of booming the city's population, Portland annexed these two towns in 1891. This would be only the beginning of a period of several years of annexing several nearby sections of land that included places like Selwood and St. John's. And right in the middle of this happened an event that I have addressed numerous times in my videos, the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition, which helped instigate an explosion of population growth. The city nearly doubled in population from 1890 to 1900, but a lot of that was due to the amount of land that was annexed. And while this affected the next decade, the city's population grew from 90,426 in 1900 to 207,214 by 1910, a nearly 130% growth. So not only was the city expanding land-wise, but the population was continuing to boom. At more than 301,000 people by 1930, one can safely say Portland had changed a great deal since 1891. Something that didn't change much, the system of addresses within the city. Not a big problem though, right? Well, let's talk. When you are your own little city, and you start reeling in other cities and communities around you, it's kind of like starting a school project and then adding others to make it a group project. Suddenly you have a few different minds with different perspectives. Well, These towns, before being annexed by Portland, had their own systems. Some of these were noted in 1891. It was found after these towns were annexed that Portland found itself with several streets that went under the same name but were not in proximity or in line with each other. While it was claimed that these duplicated streets had their names changed in 1891, come the start of the 1930s, Portland still found itself dealing with instances of duplicated street names. People would arrive at one address expecting to be at a totally different place. Postal workers often delivered parcels to the wrong location because of a duplicated address. Dating all the way back to the turn of the century, postal workers had started their push for changing the city's street numbering system. These other towns had their own numbering systems that were just wrapped into Portland without being adjusted as necessary. What's even more concerning was that police and firefighters would encounter this problem as well. One story was reported, likely resembling several others, that firefighters trying to get to a fire ended up visiting 3 different locations due to confusion about the address. There had to be at least a handful of locals who lost or had their homes severely damaged simply because the fire department had a hard time finding their location. And what only confused things further is that both Portland and East Portland, pre-1891, had alphabetized streets. Starting at what would become Ankeny Street on the west side and going north, the streets went up: A Street, B Street, C Street, and so on. But on the east side, starting at what would become Gleason Street, there was an A Street, then B Street, C Street, and so on, but instead of increasing as they went north, they increased as they went south. This was fixed in 1891 with the west side streets keeping their alphabetized theme just with names. A Street became Ankeny, B Street became Burnside, C Street became Cooch, and so on. The streets on the east side were renamed, but instead of keeping the alphabetized theme, they just took on the names of the streets they synced up with on the west side of the river, as makes sense. And quick side note, in St. John's, it was found that on one street, the addresses progressed in one direction, and sometimes the very next street down, the address numbers would progress in the opposite direction. It's been noted that when all of these street names changed, there was limited outcry, even though it changed the addresses of many people. The city's work in the early 1930s would not be quite as simple. The city of Portland, in particular the original town, had smaller sized blocks than other cities, an artifact of the early days of settling the town and selling off lots. The numbered system only had 20 numbers per block as opposed to 100 numbers as would become the norm in cities all over the country. With fewer numbers to work with, it's no surprise that so many places had half-number addresses, which allowed for going beyond the only 20 available numbers per block. It was a mess. Duplicated streets, duplicated addresses, confused postal workers, confused emergency personnel. It's bewildering that it would not be until the 1920s that a serious push truly started to establish a proper system to renumber the city. It was probably just one of those things where the average Joe knew about the address oddities, but weren't all that bothered by it until their lives ended up being seriously affected by it. There's a pretty wide margin between having a letter show up late to your mailbox because the mailman got lost and having your home burned down. And the hero of finally making this project a reality, at least one of them in terms of keeping the project alive for years, helping it finally get implemented, was Asbury Lincoln Barbur. Commissioner Barbur, as he was known during the Renumbering project, was the kind of civic servant that not only Portland, but all cities are in dire need of today. He was dedicated to getting work done when it needed to be, and he often got projects done at or under budget. He was so good at saving money that someone at one point reportedly called him a socialist. Born in 1861 in Polk County, Oregon, Barbur had years of bookkeeping experience, helping him to become the city auditor of Portland in 1907, a position he would hold for a decade. In 1917, he was elected the Commissioner of Public Works for Portland. He was critical in getting the streets of Portland paved, another project that he kept costs down on. Establishing a new address system for the city had become a major passion of his during this time as well, with his efforts going back to the mid-20s. In an article from 1935, I found a reference to news from 25 years earlier, dating back to 1910, which referenced, even back then, a plan to renumber the city was prepped to go before the city council. This plan would split the city into 4 districts, presumably a northwest, southwest, northeast, and southeast, with Burnside as the north-south divider and East Water Avenue, the divider between the east and west sides of town. And even before this, it appeared the city regarded Hood Street, now Hood Avenue, at some point as a west side baseline, and Patton Avenue, now Interstate Avenue, as an east side baseline. But it would not be until the dawn of the 30s that the project finally started taking off, at least in a way. Like most major city-altering projects, this one was not going to happen overnight. Commissioner Barbur personally called out big business within the city as the major factor in such a project not going forward in a quicker fashion. Regardless, come November 1929, he was making his last push to establish what, again, would become the city's great renumbering project. His hope was to convince the city to put the project on the ballot for a May 1930 election. With the stock market crash happening in October 1929 and a long-term depression looming, Barbur also saw projects such as this as a great way to provide those out of work with at least short-term employment. The ongoing resistance was strong enough still that the project did not make that May 1930 ballot. Come March of that year, the new objective was to get the project on the November ballot. Through this all, Commissioner Barbur harped on the almost always accurate fact that the longer everyone waited to implement this system, the more complicated and expensive it would get. His accusations against big business in the city were also well-founded. Several businessmen in town, focused on the bottom line, were concerned about the costs of having to change their mailing lists and adjusting bookkeeping accordingly with their need for having a new address. Most of them had established themselves at their prior address for years. Customers and/or clients had grown to identify them as being at said address, and now that was all going to change. This is not to say there weren't genuine concerns about implementing the Great Renumbering. It was believed even after changing addresses, there would still be mail mix-ups, long afterward. Another key supporter on this project, very much the brains behind it, was city engineer Olaf Largaard, a man who deserves a video all to himself considering the number of Portland projects he was directly involved in, making the Columbia Slough Drainage Channel, widening Sandy Boulevard, reviving the city's waterfront, improvements on Powell Boulevard and Foster Road, and so on. Originally from Norway, Largaard became a prominent person in Portland in the 1910s, going from an engineer for a finance company to city engineer in 1917. If there was an engineering organization in existence at that time, it was likely Mr. Largaard was a member of it. Obviously invested in improving the city, he was fully behind establishing a new, robust address system for it. While changes would happen to it over time, as of the spring of 1930, the general plan was to break the city into a collection of districts, or sections. I'm going to stick with the word district. These would ultimately become the 5 districts that made up Portland for a long time, before the 2018 edition of the South Portland District. These being the North, Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, and southwest districts. But as of 1930, there were still 3 east side districts in the planning, but they were going to be called the Northeast, East, and Southeast districts. The Northeast was generally what North Portland would become, while the East would be the middle portion of the East Side, which I guess makes sense, or rather the southern portion of Northeast Portland and the northern portion of Southeast Portland. And Southeast would have just been whatever was left south of there. There was contemplation also going on as to whether the section where a given street was located would show up as a prefix or suffix in their address. Ultimately, having the section as a prefix was chosen. A lot of this planning and organization was done by Olaf Largard. But the suggestion of having the abbreviated district in between the number and the street name came from Postmaster John M. Jones. He felt having it in the middle somewhere would force people to utilize it, as, based on his past experience with the district at the start of people's addresses, people would tend to omit them or just not use them. With the project seemingly moving forward, with Barbur's next step being to present it to the city's Chamber of Commerce, the outline of the project already made its first adjustments. It's at this time that the 3 East Side districts became what they're known as now: North, Northeast, and Southeast. At this time, the 2 districts on the West Side were called West and South, but would eventually become Northwest and Southwest. Now, if you're curious as to why there were 3 districts planned on the East Side and only 2 on the West, it was not because the East Side was simply larger, but it was also because of the baselines that were set to separate these districts. Burnside Street became the baseline separating the north and south ends of town, replacing Ankeny Street in this regard. Located only a block south of Burnside, this made sense as Ankeny was an odd choice for such significance, considering on the west side, Ankeny does not go beyond Park Avenue. The Willamette River then served as the baseline for the east and west sides. However, the further north the river goes, the more it hooks in a northwestern direction. Because of this, a portion of the east side of the river is located directly above much of the west side. Due to this, it was considered, since a major portion of the project was trying to narrow roads that were in alignment down to one name, changing the names of the routes going north and south on the north end to match those directly south of them, but across the river in the downtown area. A problem here is this meant that these routes on the north end would have all become numbered in that alignment. But with routes traveling north and south on the east side also being numbered, the north end of town would have had numbered routes going in opposite directions, one going east from Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and the others going west from what newspapers said would have been Gattenbane Avenue, even though Haight Avenue, a block west, I feel more lined up with First Avenue in downtown. In that case, Gattenbane would have lined up with Front Avenue. Pretty chaotic. Anyway, that's why there's 3 districts on the east side. In the end, the decision was made to make this area directly north of the west side its own district, simply calling it North Portland, existing in a realm all to itself. While aligned with the west, which was located more or less to the south, it is still on the east side of the river and connects directly to the northeast district. Williams Avenue was selected as the baseline route separating the north and northeast districts. These 3 baselines would remain through this project and remain the separating routes between the original 5 of the now 6 districts within the city. It had also been decided, rather early on, that the significant Front Avenue along the waterfront would be changed to Riverside Avenue. This was the first reported of what would be hundreds of street name changes that would happen through the course of this project, and yet, for whatever reason, This particular change never actually happened, even though it had obviously been in the works for years. By the time the project was wrapping up in 1933, it was also announced that Macadam Avenue, which ran south of downtown and roughly aligned with Front Avenue, would have its name changed to become a stretch of Riverside Avenue. While Front Avenue would eventually have its name changed to the Nato Parkway, Macadam Avenue still exists to this day. And the plan was set, when the new addresses were set, to do what everyone else was doing and expand the numbers that ran a given block from 20 to 100. Thus, for each block one travels, the number of a given address increases by 100. And another thing that would change over time, the schedule was set to give those in town a year to make the full transition from their old address to their new one. This led to an understanding that, for a time, people would have their old and new addresses interchangeably and could technically use both during this grace period. And these numbers would start from these baseline locations. To make sense of this, I will use the intersection of Northeast 29th and Cooch. A block north of Burnside, a place on 29th near Cooch would have around a 100 address, as it's a block north of a baseline route. A place on Cooch, near the intersection of 29th, would have an address close to Northeast 2900 Cooch. So, traveling down the worded streets, it's fairly easy to know where addresses are today, as the number associates with the nearest numbered streets. Times 100, of course. If a house is on the block of Cooch between 29th and 30th, their address would be between 2901 and 2999. In establishing what the specific numbers would be for a given building or house, a system was employed of counting the distance the home was from the nearest side street in feet, and then multiplying that number by 2/10. The example they provided in a newspaper was if a home was 60 feet off of 15th Avenue, then multiplying 60 by 2/10 or 0.2 would equal 12. Thus, the address number would be 1512. Simply put, the further north or south of Burnside one travels on north and south traveling streets, the larger the number of a given address. I recall as a kid my grandmother living just off of Burnside and only having a 35 address, which bewildered me as I mostly grew up south of Portland and we always had a 5-digit address. And, just like with Burnside, the further east or west of the Willamette River, not including the North District, one goes, but on an east and west traveling street, the larger the number of a given address will be. And the further east or west of Williams Avenue, also on east and west traveling streets one goes, the larger the numbers of a given address will be. I know it's a lot of info, but this was where the Great Renumbering Project was during its early stages. This project also helped propel Burnside Street to greater prominence within Portland. Not only was it designated a baseline street, but while the Great Renumbering was going into effect, Burnside was also in the process of being widened in close proximity to the river. Because most buildings along Burnside were fairly close to it before the widening, something had to give. On the east side, many buildings had the front of their first floors removed, allowing the sidewalks to be moved back into that space and for Burnside to be widened into the space formerly occupied by those sidewalks. On the west side, on Skid Row, the full front portions of many buildings were lobbed off to allow space for widening. This is why, if you drive through this area today, you might notice a lot of the buildings on Burnside are rather thin. That's what happens when your whole front end gets taken off. The Burnside widening project was just one of several going on in Portland in the early 1930s, providing employment to many Great Depression affected men. One of these early 30s projects was the 4th Avenue Extension Project, a route that would ultimately become known as Barbur Boulevard. You can take a guess as to who that was named after. Initially, the city took inspiration from a similar project done in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but in the end, the city would more focus on a project conducted in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Because Portland used the Milwaukee project as a pattern to follow, they actually managed to save in the area of $1,500 to $2,000 because they were saved from the expenses of coming up with their own idea. In this early period, C.A. McClure, Secretary of Portland's City Planning Commission, also attended a national city planning conference in Denver, Colorado. He gleaned some extra inspiration from a system used in Spokane, Washington, a project highly regarded for very clear number tiles being placed on the homes and buildings in that town, something that would become very important in this project. With an actual planned out project in place, Commissioner Barbur began putting together what was called an advisory committee, among other names, including representatives from various clubs all over town. And Ivan Anderson, chairman of the Federation of Community Clubs, was made chairman of this advisory committee, and he'd stay intimately involved in the project. This committee also had the full support of Postmaster John M. Jones, the Bureau of Police, the city's Realty Board, and the city's Water Bureau. While the project would not make the November 1930 ballot either, it was during this month that Barbur and this advisory committee met with the city council and made a motion to adopt this new system. This helped kick the project up to the Portland Planning Commission officially, and this is where some more adjustments to the project were made. By this time, the two West Side districts, West and South, had their names finally changed to what they would remain, Northwest and Southwest. It was at this time that the decision was made to convert all of the north and south traveling routes to streets, and all of the east and west traveling routes to avenues, with some exceptions, mainly for prominent stretches like Sandy Boulevard, scenic, and arterial routes. Eventually, this street and avenues plan would be reversed, with north and south traveling routes becoming avenues and east and west traveling routes becoming streets. Can you imagine a world with Burnside Avenue or Interstate Street? That almost happened. As mentioned earlier, it was a focus of the project to convert routes that were in line with each other but under multiple names to a single name, to quell any confusion. It might be a little bewildering for someone to travel down a certain street only to look up at a sign a few minutes later and not see the name of the route they thought they were traveling on. For reference, in my video that I did on 82nd Avenue, I found that prior to the mid-1910s it was called Anderson Road. Just south of there, traveling south of Portland into Clackamas County, the route was called Meridian Road. While done before the Great Renumbering project, this route was all converted to 82nd Avenue. Still in all, the project continued to be delayed. Come April 1931, Commissioner Barbur and his committee brought about the plan again for hopeful approval. Come May 13th of that year, a public hearing was held to discuss the project. According to newspapers, the city council adopted it at this time, even though the ordinance for it would not be passed until September. While resistance from local business owners had stuck around for a while, by this time the resistance had dwindled considerably. Perhaps they realized at this point that it was a losing battle. This project desperately needed to happen. It was determined that the project would cost about $60,000 to implement. But almost immediately there were problems with this. The city had already noted that their funds had been stretched as thin as they could go, and that sacrifices needed to be made in other areas to make the funding for this project work. But even with the $10,000 budgeted for signs, within a week after the September 1931 City Council passing of the plan, it was reported more than half of that money had already been spent, and the remainder was being redirected for workers to be brought on for sewer work. The This left the city needing to refigure where to obtain the money to get the real work on this project off the ground. A couple months later, in November, it was noted that the city's Tax Conservation Commission was looking into approving funds to at least get the first portion of the project going, and this was met with their approval the following month. So despite these financial barriers, come the end of 1931, the renumbering project was still good to go. With 1931 being the primary year that progress really began on this project, leaving many buildings facing the unavoidable future of an address change, I noticed something that may possibly be directly related to this project. Of all the pictures I have seen of Portland over the years, something I noticed was that a great deal of pictures taken in 1931, and on into 1932 even, were simple pictures of businesses around town. Several of these were businesses in the St. John's area, which, spoiler, is where the first work on the project would be done. I'm wondering if the reason for at least a large number of these pictures being taken was related to this renumbering project, knowing lots of businesses were going to have new numbers slapped on them soon. That being said, there were a good many projects happening in Portland during the early 1930s, some of which even required the removal of buildings, and certainly some of these pictures may be related to those projects as well. Just a little side observation I had. With the general outline set for the project and with it close to being officially adopted, a critical issue that still needed to be dealt with was how these new addresses would be presented, meaning how they would be visible to outsiders from buildings in the city. For a while, the consideration was made to put addresses on the curbstones in front of buildings, but even today there's many residential blocks in town where there are no curbs. But prior to the Great Renumbering, addresses were chiseled into the curbs of various parts of town. Some of these can still be found on curbs today in the city, showing addresses that no longer exist. In fact, in one of my Portland Then and Now videos, while wandering the Irvington neighborhood, I stumbled onto a few of these old addresses. I've found them in numerous parts of town, but this was a rare time where I actually stopped and caught video of some of them. Ultimately, the city, in staying with the style of the city that inspired them, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, chose to obtain a certain type of tile to be placed on its buildings. White tiles with bold black numbers. Many homes around Portland still have these tiles on them to this day. They were given the nickname of Asbury titles after Asbury Barbur, but at the time, in the 1930s, this was another element of the project that was complicated since Portland had a variety of different homes and some people just didn't like the look of the tiles or didn't want to have the same tiles as everyone else. Early on, Commissioner Barbur suggested as possible places to put these tiles, the second step of a home's porch or on some place in front of the house. Having the numbers clearly visible was a top priority. Before this project, several homes in town had no numbers on them at all, while others had numbers on them that were too small or were obstructed from view. The worst of this was in the Linton area, today the northern end of northwest Portland. In a 1932 article, the plight of Little Linton was expressed. Reportedly having been founded in 1843, even today Linton gives off small town vibes, so perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising that despite having their own system once upon a time, by the early 1930s they just didn't seem to be following it. Very few buildings even had numbers on them, and they were so taboo to have in the first place that when a local tried to open a garage, he was extremely resistant to getting address numbers on it because it would supposedly make him look conspicuous in the area. In response to this, it was determined Linton would be one of the first spots to get new address titles, but it would actually end up being one of the last places addressed. Ultimately, a supplemental budget of $33,605 was set for work to be conducted in 1932. At this point, we were still nearly a year away from the grunt work taking off. It was also determined that about 85,000 tiles needed to be manufactured for that specific work, something that would use up more than half of that year's budget. Altogether, it was believed about 150,000 tiles would be necessary to cover the whole project. This was rather short, as by November 1932, another 180,000 tiles were purchased for work to be done in 1933. The contract for making said tiles was awarded to Gladden McBean and Company of Glendale, California in April 1932. To keep some of the work local, the Portland Metal Spinning Works was given the contract for producing the aluminum frames that would go around the tiles. These frames were produced from 7 tons of aluminum. The Portland Metal Works was listed as being at 394 Grand Avenue, but because this info comes from before the project started, this is a pre-1933 address. This means the present address for where the metal works were once located would be 1836 Northeast Grand Avenue, the southeast corner of Grand and Hancock Street. While the work of producing the tiles to readdress the structures of Portland was off and running, the city was preparing the schedule for when the work would finally begin. Planned to start in October 1932, the work would actually start nearly 2 months sooner. The work was done by what one might call a skeleton crew. At a given time, 3 crews of 3 men would work on a given home. When a number of other projects started taking off in late 1932, leading to thousands of new jobs for locals, only 12 more men were hired for the Great Renumbering project. And apparently, bicycle cars, as they were called, were produced to help the workers transport the tiles and frames between buildings. And all of this officially began on August 5th, 1932, with a celebration in the St. John's area. During this celebration, the first numbers from a new address were placed on a building, that being the Peninsula National Bank at Philadelphia and Jersey. Previously at 101 Philadelphia Avenue, the new address was 7340 North Philadelphia. This introduction, with some fanfare, made sense as the North District, or the Peninsula District as it was originally called, was selected to be the first to get new numbers. Both Olaf Largaard and Asbury Barbur pushed for work to start as soon as possible, meaning whenever those tiles arrived, which is probably why the work planned for October actually began in August. The rest of the work began after a weekend off, with the main tiling beginning on August 8th. At this point, it was felt the renumbering of the buildings around town would take between 15 and 18 months, but it would ultimately end up taking less than a year. But before getting into the intrigue and drama of the actual readdressing itself, it's important to pause a moment and give credit where credit is due. While the news focused most of their attention on the details of the project and its gradual progression towards becoming a reality, the work of those who had to create this whole address system in advance was not well represented. Sure, once duplicated streets were removed and baseline locations were established, the organization of these address numbers was at least framed, but still, property by property, they had to figure out what new numbers each new home and building would have based on their particular locations. That's some real work there. Their work is best represented by a document that I have referred to at least a couple hundred times on previous projects, this being a listing for all of the address changes made within the Portland area. When covering stories that predated the Great Renumbering, wherein locations are given addresses, I have had to reference this document to find out where those locations are today. And within this document, there are further details given in relation to how this project was organized. The directory was compiled and published by the Crane Direct Mail Service, listed at 45 4th Street, which is funny because this address, posted in this directory of new addresses, is actually another pre-1933 address. Within this directory, we can find that their true present-day address would be 115 Southwest 4th Avenue, or near 4th and Burnside. This document also laid out the new 100 numbers per block system, and that even numbered addresses would be on the south and east side of the city streets, while odd numbered addresses would be on the north and west side of their streets. The area between Front Avenue and the river and south of Jefferson were given zeros at the start of their addresses, and on the east side, east of 41st Avenue, the numbers of homes and buildings out there were unchanged. However, street names were, and that meant that while the number did not change, the street name could. An example they gave was that 3456 54th Avenue became 3456 Southeast Inslee Street. In the end, a few hundred street changes would be made over the course of the project, but we'll get back to that. With work taking off in the North District, the first of multiple instances of locals making street change requests occurred. In particular, people in St. John's asked that a spot where Fessenden Street hooked to the southwest to be changed to St. Louis Avenue. And that's how it is today. This would be reported as the first official street change of the whole project, seeing as the Riverside Avenue replacement would end up falling through. While described as a difficult area physically to do this project, in the first 2 weeks of work about 2,000 new numbers had been placed on homes in the North District, and after just over a month they hit 6,000 new address numbers put up. The progress was so great, and even ahead of schedule, that by November 1932, the project was briefly slowed when they literally ran out of tiles for the number 4. And the daily work of these number men was an adventure in and of itself. Most of the small crews put together to do this work were young, as the work needed to be done by spry, able-bodied men who were effective with the necessary tools they used. While reportedly thousands of adults clamored to anyone who would listen to them that they would never be able to understand this new system, kids around town were fascinated by it. They would often hang around the workers as they progressed, offering to help in any way they could, be it helping carrying numbers or even ringing the doorbells to homes. People would probably be more docile with a kid at their door than one of these workers. And in relation to that, it was noted in newspapers that women often reacted to the arrival of these workers with great hostility until the workers explained what they were there for. Turned out these women had been so inundated by door-to-door salesmen that the mere sight of a strange man at their door set them off, at first. And I actually want to pause real quick just to reference this particular photograph. For a project this big, there's surprisingly not a lot of photographs out there in relation to what was done, so pictures like this should almost be coveted. And yet there's something very interesting about this. Some people were trying to figure out on Vintage Portland in the comment section, they were trying to figure out exactly where this house was, and you'd think they would have some luck because you see the old address there along with the new address they're putting up. But something they discovered was the address, the new one in the new tiles that's actually put up there, is not accurate. The actual address is 3942, and you see it as 3924, so the guy that's standing right there, obviously having just finished putting the tiles in, he actually put the 2 and 4 in backwards, which I'm assuming got fixed at some time, but we can't really say for absolute certainty, because if you see this house on Google Maps, first of all, if you look at a map from above, it's the only property in the area where you do not see the actual address on the, rectangle where the house is located. And if you go down to see street views, no matter what time period you try to see this house from, it's obstructed by shrubbery, so you can't get a clear look at what the actual address is on it. But I looked it up, and there's at least one of those real estate sites that shows it as 3942, so I'm going to assume that is the address. But one last little thing that I think is really cool is the few angles on Google Maps where you can kind of see the front of the house from an angle around the trees. You can see the white by the door. You can see those original tiles, at least as of 2019, those original tiles are still there. So the tiles you see in this old picture are those tiles you see on the house today. As this work continued on, street names again were changed consistently. It seemed like every couple of weeks another dozen names were changed. In some instances, a whole stretch was renamed, but oftentimes it was short stretches that were renamed often to match with an aligning street. Lots of worded streets in line with numbered streets and vice versa. This became almost as much of a thorn in the side of locals as the whole notion of having to deal with a new address. I'm a little surprised I found no stories of locals running off or getting confrontational with the workers as they put up numbers on their dwellings, because some people were so adverse to, in particular, their street names being changed, that they still referred to their streets by their old names afterward. And on the flip side, some wanted their street names changed unsuccessfully. One of these included residents of the Piedmont neighborhood wanting to change Albina Avenue to Piedmont Avenue. While about 3/4 of the residents in the area wanted this change, it never happened. One of the most controversial changes was deemed necessary with how significant this renumbering had made Burnside Street. Burnside, which runs east and west while the routes south of it go at an angle, means that these roads that were supposed to be running parallel to it would ultimately intersect with it at an angle. Its intersection with Washington Street happened to be at 16th Avenue, but they no longer intersect today due to Interstate 405 traveling through there. But back before the renumbering, when these two streets came together, it became Washington Street, which made sense as Washington Street was one of the most prominent of early Portland streets. The dock of Washington Street was a major spot in the city's early port days. When I discussed the city's first frame house in another video, that house was built at First and Washington. It was a far more prominent street than Burnside, but with Burnside becoming a baseline street, it made sense to convert Washington beyond 16th to Burnside. This frustrated many locals who tried to fight back against it to no avail. And, interestingly enough, only 4 blocks west of here, a Trinity Place was changed to a numbered route, but when literally everyone on the street fought this, the city just agreed to change it back to Trinity Place. I always wondered, walking through this area, why there's randomly this street intermingled with all the numbered avenues. And as was always going to be a consistent issue with a project like this, there was more mail-related drama. One issue was the Christmas season that came in late 1932, wherein a great number of homes had already changed their addresses. But with the Great Depression on hand, many people were sending mail, and Christmas cards in this case, as 1-cent general mail instead of 3-cent first-class mail. This created an even greater likelihood that if they were sending mail to the Portland area and they hadn't got the updated address, it was unlikely their card would make it to their intended destination. And the postal system tried to help in this with mail carriers leaving cards at homes all over town imploring them to let everyone they knew of their new addresses to better guarantee mail would make it to the right place. For example, if someone still had an old address and mailed a letter to 1108 Harrison Street, it would end up going to a place near Southeast Harrison and 11th, next to Ladd's Addition. But the old address, where the letter was intended to go, would end up going to 3712 Southeast Harrison, putting it several blocks east, near 37th and Harrison. As 1932 gave way to 1933, another element of this project was the putting up of new street signs. New street signs had started going up shortly before the project started. Here's one example from 1932 showing some fairly new street signs at Holiday Avenue and Union Avenue North. These signs obviously had to stop being put up as they were just around the corner from becoming obsolete. While I would assume that whatever new signs made at this point were discarded, there was a reference later that small signs bearing the 5 abbreviated district names were just being clipped onto street signs to update them. Guess it keeps things simple. So perhaps some of the already made signs were still put up, just with these later adjustments. Whether or not this happened, still, in January 1933, the city started taking bids to produce new street signs to put up in accordance with the new addresses. By the start of February, with work in the North District wrapping up, Most new address tiles were put up in the Northeast District as well, and work was underway in the Southeast District. This work started in the space mainly between Burnside and Holgate Streets, running from the river to 41st Avenue. It appears this work took roughly 2 months, as by the start of April, work had shifted to getting new numbers up between Holgate and the south border of town. And clearly, the focus was completing the east side before moving to the west side. The east side was larger, and just perhaps it gave a lot of those major commercial buildings on the west side some extra time before having to take the dive like everyone else. Or perhaps it was because the toughest work laid ahead. According to that directory that was put out for the address changes that occurred, there are 5 pages that list all of the street changes that happened. The first 2 pages cover changes that happened on the east side, while the other 3 pages cover what happened on the west side. The copy I have doesn't list any changes in North Portland, but something I noticed is that the number of street changes on the west side is about double the changes on the east side. And what's also so interesting, perhaps there's a mistake in here somewhere, is that the directory says that the listings within were as of February 1933, which would imply that all of the planned street changes for the project had been established by then. However, there were more changes done after that, in particular on the west side. All in all, hundreds of street changes occurred, seemingly in excess of what was planned. This all came to a head later in the project, in May 1933, when Ivan Anderson, chairman of the advisory committee that helped get the project going, lashed out at City Council. He criticized them for clearly not having a complete plan in place when they started the work. He called them out for making so many changes that those busy out there doing the dirty work could not keep up. It wouldn't surprise me if some homes had to be returned to because, after having their new address tiles put up, their addresses were changed again and the tiles had to be adjusted accordingly. Anderson also made the claim that, even at this point, there were still stretches of town where a single street was going under different names. And there were still delays in getting new street signs up because of these ongoing changes. This was important as far as new reports went, this whole project was coming off without a hitch. But as far as Anderson was concerned, it seemed making street changes had become almost an obsession for those in control of the project. According to him, this had gotten so out of hand that they made a change to a Melinda Avenue, which existed in southwest Portland, but they had it listed to another part of town. Just a little bit incompetent, if Anderson was telling the truth. I get the feeling he probably was. He seemed to be coming from a good place, more troubled than anything else by the idea that the citizens of Portland had been sold on this project, years in the making, and inconvenient at different levels depending on the person involved. A project predicated on its simplicity, and yet things were just getting more and more complicated. This all unfortunately created some animosity between Ivan Anderson and Commissioner Barbur, who I am sure at this point was so elated the project was happening after years of pushing it, and he didn't want a bunch of drama now that it was almost done. After Anderson made his complaints, Barbur asked him to put his complaints in writing. When Anderson refused to do this, Barbur simply said that he would pay no further attention to him then. And then, 2 weeks after this confrontation, the city reported another batch of 50 street name changes. Granted, most of these were the address changes finally being made in the Linton area, again, a location that was initially going to be one of the first areas dealt with. There are 2 interesting changes listed in this particular bunch. One was a stretch of Lonsdale Avenue, which was changed to Southwest 15th Avenue. Even though there was plans to not alter street names that were done after those prominent to early Portland history, this one, named after Daniel Lonsdale, a very influential figure in early Portland, was changed. But Lonsdale does have his own block in downtown, in fact, right across Main Street in downtown from Lonsdale Square is Chapman Square, named after William Chapman. Another prominent early Portlander, he also had a street named after him in town that was changed during this renumbering project. These two were critical to the establishment of Portland's downtown South Park blocks. The other interesting change, a route I've covered in another short video, Hillsdale Boulevard was changed to Leif Erikson Drive. Constructed cutting through the hills around Forest Park when it was thought the land would be great for residential development, Hillsdale Boulevard became better known as a desolate stretch often closed due to landslides. It would be changed to Leif Erikson Drive during this project, and today it is a prime walking trail through the park. I've been up and down it many times. And while still on the subject of street changes, I found during my research that Portland used to have a Brilliance Street. And I don't like that that's no longer a thing. Also, Westover Road, which branches off Northwest 23rd, just off Burnside, was another route whose name was changed. This actually used to be the beginning of Cornell Road, which is a primary route cutting through the West Hills on the northwest end of town. With Westover hooking away about a block from where Cornell Road starts today, I initially just assumed that Cornell used to cut right through that block. But maps prior to this project show the road still the same, and houses that now stand on that block date back to the early 1910s. So there was just this little gap. It actually kind of makes sense that they did change the name in this regard, even if they didn't absolutely have to. Through the process of all of these changes, it was reported in local papers that the project had officially made Burnside the longest continuous stretch in the city, replacing Union Avenue, which later became Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And while many street changes were still being reported, by the end of May 1933, mostly on the west side, the work on the west side started going on April 18th. By this time, Assistant City Engineer R.G. Reagan reported that a total of 51,069 tiles had been placed on homes around town. The west side work first started in the Chinatown area, which made sense as it bordered Burnside just to the north of it. While the east side work started in early August 1932 and finished in late April 1933, the west side work took less than 2.5 months. Sure, it was a smaller area, but still, some pretty impressive speed. The city of Portland was also trying to influence surrounding areas to also adjust their addresses to go along with this new system, in particular out east and towards the town of Gresham. Decades later, Portland would annex a lot more land to its east as well. But some changes outside of the city limits did happen ultimately to sync up with the new system. While some streets of prominence had already changed their names in years previous, they still had existed under their old names outside of town. This included Stark Street, which was originally known and still existed outside of town as Baseline Road. Division Street still existed under its prior name of Section Line Road out of town. Powell Boulevard still existed as Powell Valley Road, out of town. These all changed at the time of the Renumbering project. While it was predicted the overall project would be completed by the end of the summer, all homes officially graced with their new addresses and tiles to match was officially regarded as completed on July 1st, 1933. Interestingly enough, this would be the day after Commissioner Asbury Barbur officially retired as a city's public servant. Not that it matters in the broad scheme of this story, but I found that as a retirement gift, he was given a new icebox. Altogether, this project had represented 23 months of continuous work, from the grassroots work and getting the project up off the ground, up through the grunt work of getting new numbers up all over town. and the city wasted little time at this point in keeping the pressure on once the work of making street changes and getting the tiles up on buildings was completed. While the city always expressed wanting to give people more than enough time to adjust to their new addresses, by the early July completion of the project's work, the city said that by October 1st, 1933, all of the old addresses would be out of service. Olaf Largaard, prime organizer of the project as a whole, even had a form produced that people could use to report their changes. It stated, "Please take notice that after September 1st, 1933, notice they already trying to bump it up from October 1st to September 1st, our home address has changed from blank to blank. This is due to numerous street name changes and the installation of an entirely new house numbering system in the city of Portland." This was a death knell to those that, even at this point, were resistant to the project. Many tried to refuse their new addresses, continuing to refer to their streets by their old names. According to AlamedaHistory.org, people who ran crooked businesses out of their homes would remove the new address numbers from their houses so that their clients wouldn't get confused. I suppose this still could have worked even after the old addresses were officially kaput. Oh, and while talking about complications near the end of the project, I found a reference to the fact that numerous people around town had their telephone service temporarily disconnected in relation to the project. This revealed a complication that was destined to come about during a project such as this. A new city directory, which would include phone numbers, sure, but also addresses, was delayed until all the final aspects of this project were ironed out. Because of this, all the city had for a while was an old directory containing mostly the old addresses. This certainly added to the confusion. Sure, people were still allowed, at least until October, to interchange their old and new addresses, but still, if one was trying to find a place in town at this time, they would likely look at the city directory, where they would find the old address, which, with the new numbers up, would lead them to the wrong location. The very thing the city was trying to eradicate with this project. It's okay. It only took almost another year for the next directory to come out. And as far as problems the renumbering system was supposed to eradicate still being around, back to the postal issues. The city, again, really wanted surrounding areas to embrace and continue this numbering system beyond the city limits to have an even larger and simple overall system in the county. In relation to postal workers, places outside of Portland weren't much different than the towns the city had annexed before the Great Renumbering. Namely, there were still the occasional duplicate addresses. And as far as roads that ran along the city's boundary, the side that was in Portland followed the new system, while the side directly across the street followed a completely different system. It can just never be easy, can it? In all fairness, by the time of the announcement of the new city directory in June 1934, it was mentioned that the system had extended beyond just Portland, going from the Multnomah-Clackamas County border up to the Columbia River, and from the Multnomah-Washington County border as far east as Buckley Avenue, which would become part of 122nd. While within the city of Portland today, back in the 1930s, Buckley would have been several blocks east of the city's boundary. And that was how it all happened. And the relevance of this 1930s project cannot be understated. It's not that this was a nice little improvement on the simplicity and stability of a city that lasted until the next big project came along. More than 90 years later, the structure established by this project still exists. Burnside, Williams, and the Willamette River are still the key dividers of the city's districts. the addition of a South District in 2020, after approval in 2018, existing primarily between Barbur Boulevard and the Willamette River going east and west, and I-405 and Tryon Creek State Park going north and south, is the only significant change to that system since the 1930s, aside from the occasional later street changes, such as Union becoming MLK in 1989 and 39th becoming Cesar Chavez Boulevard in 2009. Any changes made since the project have been meek by comparison, and even the creation of the South Portland District stems from an artifact of that great renumbering. When this project was done, any addresses, again on the west side but east of Front Avenue, had a 0 at the start of them. It's almost like they were in a no man's land. In people living in this area having 0s at the start of their addresses, this made for issues both technologically as well as with 911 and emergency response. Creating a new district with an S prefix allowed the removal of these 0s and prevented other possible future complications. And beyond that, on the whole, it was fairly successful. Portland is generally known as an easy town to get around in, geographically speaking. In terms of traffic, that can be a whole other story. And even back then, when the project was first finished, it was heralded as establishing one of the best modern systems existing in the United States. The levels with which it simplified a city made any potential shortcomings of it practically irrelevant by comparison. When I'm out walking around and looking for a particular address, I can pull it up and rarely even need to check my map app because due to the simplicity of our system, even if I'm in an area I don't know that well, I usually get where I need to go fairly easily. It's one of those very important things that many of us unknowingly encounter, sometimes several times a day. A little something that makes our often complicated lives a little easier to manage, sometimes hiding in plain sight. In accordance with when the events of this video took place, there was a little something else going on, that being the works of the Number Man, or I guess Number Men, as there was more than one of them. Dressed to the nines, these men were photographed extensively at the end of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, posing in front of certain properties around town and holding a number in front of them. Their work is somewhat left to mystery, in particular as to the identities of who these men were. To this day, we don't know. But obviously, they were out there doing something for a reason. In fact, their work coincided with the large number of various public works projects happening in Portland during this time. The numbers they held corresponded to the number associated with the property that they stood in front of. Many of these properties they stood before were altered in some way in relation to a given project. For instance, Union Avenue was undergoing its own expansion project during this time, much like Burnside did. Buildings would suffer a similar fate to Burnside on the west side of the river, with the fronts altered to allow the avenue to expand. And there just so happens to be a plethora of photographs of our Number Man on Union Avenue, taken in 1929. The work of these men being photographed was also used in relation to the work of compensating people for their losses on an affected property. While the Number Man probably had little involvement in the Great Renumbering directly, the renumbering was one of those major projects happening at that time in a rapidly changing city which found itself needing to bring on a few dapper gentlemen to pose for simple photography that locals still talk about to this day.